ever had a burden you carried for a long time? Maybe you're in a divorce. Been through divorce. You've had a loved one pass away. Maybe you have someone who's alive and they have needs, and you live with those burdens every day. It's probably a burden in every seat today that's represented here by a person. And they're hidden. Could God have any hidden burdens? He would share his burdens. What's the song? How's it go? Lord, I can't bear this burden alone. He didn't intend us to. Cast all your care upon him, for he cares for you. But you know what? I think there's times that God, in history, like in the Old Testament, he would share his burdens with prophets. Jeremiah had a burden. If you know him as the weeping prophet, he carried the heart of God, and he wept out God's heart. God's heart was more important to him than even the people. But God had a heart for his people, didn't he? There was this temptation God had was to turn his back on his people. He even offered Israel a bill of divorcement. Please, take serious what you've done to me. I'm innocent. I have every right to send you out of my house. You're worse than a harlot. You pay for your beaux to come and lie with you. You're worse. I have every right to send you away. God had a burden. Put it on a prophet's heart. He shared it. There's a burden he gave to Isaiah one time. If you ever come across the word, the burden of the Lord, or the burden of the word of the Lord, the burden that I saw. Isaiah had this burden of a coming calamity that was going to come on Babel, on an evil nation, and all that Babel had done, and all that she was doing, and the influence she had on God's people. And God had this burden for Babel. Lost people, he has this burden. And he shared it with Isaiah, that a calamity was coming, judgment was coming. God had this burden of calamity on his heart. My spirit will not always strive with man. You remember the burden he carried before the flood? What a burden that would be. What it would be like to get next to the heart of God and feel his burden of coming judgment. Ezekiel had a burden from God about the leaders that was so disappointed, and God was so hurt and drawn out. They were not teaching his word anymore. They were leading the people astray. They were scattering his sheep. And here Ezekiel carried this burden that God had. Nahum came across with the burden of God, that God had a burden against Nineveh. Nineveh repented one time, and here Nineveh comes back 100 years later, and she's back to where she's at before. And if you know, Nineveh was eventually destroyed. But he gave that burden to Nahum of jealousy, that he wants the heart of man, of revenge, of all that I've given you, and then you turn your back on me again. Ezekiel carried that burden, and he shared that burden to others. Nahum had a burden. Nahum had the burden of jealousy. Ezekiel had the burden of the sinful leaders, and Habakkuk had the burden of the Lord that he saw. Lord, why are you showing me the sins? The burden of sin. The sin of his people, God's people. Habakkuk felt the burden of sin. Do you feel the sin? Have you been sinned against? Are you sinning and you're not stopping and you're carrying the burden and you just go day after day knowing where you're to go with it, holding out? You see it, you feel it. Malachi had a sin. a burden of the Lord, and it was the burden of a God who has loved and loved and loved and was rejected. God has burdens. They're often hidden, and they can often be hidden from his people. They can often be hidden from many, many people until he shares them. How does God share them? He'll come in word. He comes in calamity. He comes in other ways, many ways. I'm going to let's look at, if you would, turn with me for a few minutes in the book of Luke. In chapter 12, and just go look at the first couple of verses. Burden of the hidden. I'd love to talk about many, many other things. I really would. This area has been a passion in my heart over the years. Some things are just very close to me. When we're looking at the idea of the sanctity of life, and then we look at abortion. And let's just read the first couple of verses. And in the meantime, they're gathered together, an innumerable multitude of people, so that they trod one another. And he began to say unto the disciples, first, take heed to yourselves to the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known. He told them to take heed. He said, disciples, you take a hard look at what's going on around you, and even among Christianity, so to speak. You take a hard look at it. You be a discerning people. You make sure you see things for what they really are. Take a hard look for it. Take heed. And you do this for yourselves because you're vulnerable. Your heart is deceitful, disciples. You can swallow everything, hook, line, and sinker, just like anyone else. And here I am with you. I'm going to tell you, take heed. Take a hard look. Take a hard look at yourself and the vulnerability that you have. There's a leaven. Leaven is slow, disciples. It's just a little bit, and it ekes its way through the whole. An illustration, a man bought a used pair of boots. And I'm not opposed to wearing used shoes. I like hand-me-downs, and they're broken in often, sometimes broken the wrong way. This man buys a pair of boots at a garage sale, and it wasn't too long after that he dies. And they find out, man, what's going on with this guy, you know? And they find a small wound on his foot, and sometime before, the person who'd owned this boot before had been out in the desert and had been bitten by a rattlesnake, or attempted. The rattlesnake attempted to bite him. Well, a tooth had lodged in the boot and barely slipped through the leather, not harming the former owner, but eventually worked its way through and got the new owner. And eventually that poison just slowly poisoned him until he died. It wasn't a quick thing. And you know that the devil never comes at it that way. And worldly things never come at us most of the time in big freight train oncoming. It's always a slow leak when the flat comes. Take a hard look, fellows. There's leaven around us. There's such hypocrisy. These guys are acting in order to become. Make sure you don't fall into just acting the Christian part, acting in all the cliches. Make sure it's not part of your life, disciples. Make sure you're following God's script. Jesus said there's nothing that's covered. The truth will come out. With your disciples, look around you. Disciples, look around. It's going to come out what they're really like. They're open sepulchers. Jesus just gave a bunch of woes, and woe to you, lawyers, woe to you leading people, and woe, you're just empty. Look at yourselves. You're empty. Nothing's going to be covered. They're covered up with all this precious garb and all their spiritualism. They're covered up with all this, and they think they're doing all these things good, and they're even in the scriptures. But you know, they're just shallow graves. When God looks at our hearts and He sees us, and what we really are, we're very open. There's no closet that's close to God. There's no darkness that's not really light to Him. We all live in glass houses. You know, in the light of abortion, we live in such a sanitary time I understand that even early part of our country, some of our leaders wrote documents and wrote articles about abortion. And before we had clinics and a lot of technology, and I was made to understand by another pastor one time that there was abortion in Jesus' day, and we didn't have an argument, but we discussed a few things. Well, Jesus didn't bring out the word abortion. But you know, one thing I understood, and I understand from the scriptures, there was a lot of sins that he didn't bring up. Now, all the books haven't been recorded of what Jesus said. John said it's going on. But Jesus was more involved in finding and addressing the root sins. Do you know the difference between fruit sins and root sins? Abortion is not a root sin in itself. It is not the evil, folks. Jesus is saying, take heed, fellas. Go to the root of the things. What is the root sins of abortion? Like I say, it's very sanitary. You know, none of us really see the blood shed. As God looks to the sewers downstream from the clinics, he sees the blood. Do you and I see that? If we were to look in the mirror every day and we had a little video of what was going to go on today, 33 babies today could have died. 3,300 babies yesterday are going to die. If we could take a look at the blood every day, do you think there'd be a little bit of difference? These are the burdens that are not hid from God, but they're hid from us. Our abortion today in America, our technology makes it so nice and neat and so clean. And there's very little face on abortion for us today. Were it not for videos, am I not right? I don't know how many have been in an abortion clinic to see it happen. We've seen videos. Was there one brother he called the silent cry? It was shown years ago. We've made sometimes sin to be so clean and neat and put aside and not so ugly. And then we become desensitized to it. I don't know about you, but I'll go on day after day. You know, I never thought about one of those babies today. Not one baby did I think about that died. I'm ashamed of it. I'm ashamed to even talk about this subject. These are things that are not hidden from God. He hears their cry. I remember watching Michaela, born at 24 weeks, and they told us we didn't have to choose life. They sent two doctors to us. We called one of them Dr. Hope and one of them Dr. Doom, and Michaela's 24 weeks, and I think they're trying to save babies born at 20 and 21 and 22 now. And they said, you don't have to save her. Legally, nothing will be held against you. Dr. Doom came and said, listen, you're going to be looking at this, you'll be looking at that. She probably will die, or she'll have this, or she'll have that. And you're going to have all this, probably going to have all this inconvenience. Dr. Hope came by. God came by. He said, you want to save her. I don't know how that came about. It was something they did up at IU and O'Reilly. They'd send them both by to talk to you. We didn't have the choice, folks. Did you know God is pro-choice? It's his choice. Whatever inconvenience it may be to you or to me, it doesn't matter. It's his choice. Life starts in his mind. That's where true conception is. I hope you know that. I love one of the tools that CPC, or I'm saying it right, they use the ultrasound. And the women and the men who may be vulnerable to making a decision for abortion. And they bring in ultrasound and they show the baby. And what have they done when they've done that? They put a face back on that baby. God today is trying to put a face back on what he's forced to see every day. You can think however you want, but I look back even at 9/11. Brother Jim, it was amazing he brought that up about the recent massacre. And I look back at 9/11, in one day we saw 3,000 people die. Horrible, horrible death. We saw screams, people falling out of buildings. We saw people rushing in to help. And I just thought one day, the horrid thought came to me one day. I thought, my God, did you just let us see in one day what you see every day? Drawing back his hand. And the violence is just bottled up in every neighborhood. It's in Shelbyville, folks. You know that. I know that. It's bottled up in many neighborhoods. There's such violence, such hatred, such revenge waiting to happen. Whether it's with a hammer, a gun, or a ball bat, it's waiting. And God just pulls his hand back a little bit. I've been carrying this burden very long, church. Maybe I'd like for you to see. The world sees it. They're not going to interpret it right. They're going to be mad at the terrorists. They're going to be mad at this guy and that guy. Let me let you see what I see every day. There is such hypocrisy, folks. You think of the people that rushed to those buildings. What sacrifice they made to save people. What sacrifice they made. And the lady, the woman, the teacher in the schoolroom during the massacre laid her body over top the babies or the little kids. So she'd take the bullets. Hopefully one of those children would live. And there she is, running to the aid of those babies. How many people have you ran to this week that you knew was promiscuous, wanted to have an abortion, a man who's in pornography, and you know where that's going to end up someday? Folks, there's a lot more proactive we could do. I praise the Lord with the Crisis Pregnancy Center. I mean, we need to praise and push and encourage. But I think as men, this may be our sin, fellas. I'm not so sure if it's not the besetting sin of America from its beginning. Is it human life? Our forefathers knew that we were going to have to deal with the value of every human life, black, white. And remember this. Think about this. In the early days, a black man was at least worth something. You could trade him in for a wagon. He's worth a lot of money. Depends how hard he worked. And children, a little bit less. And it took the bayonet and the gun. And it took judgment on God's church, if you think about it. We're not Christians reading the same Bible, praying to the same God. We were bayoneting each other over this issue. Does life have value? Or what are my rights? And what we didn't accomplish with the gun, folks, the gun brought about the law that blacks will have as much value as a white. But folks, today you know that what a black man had back then, there was some value on his life, but now today a baby has none. Unless it's for scientific research after abortion. We have not, in our smartness and intelligence and colleges, and we have not increased in our holiness, have we, folks? We have digressed as a nation. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the woman who'd written the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, some of you all may have read that. Abraham Lincoln said she single-handedly started the Civil War with that. She put a face on what was going on in the black home in America. It should not have gone on. And she also quoted, and I should have written a quote, but she quoted in so many words that the church in America will have to answer for this. And maybe even the Civil War, and maybe even where we're at today. Putting a face back on it. I think God is very much into putting a face back on this issue. I think he wants us to see the hypocrisy in it. There's a thing that I call, and we'll be closing here in just a couple, 3 minutes, what I call cultural obedience. And this may be one of the most important things that God would want you and I to understand. Folks, years ago, my wife and I started thinking about what does it mean to have a family. I told her before we got married I wanted 12 children, and her eyes opened up. Easy for me to say. It always is, isn't it? Man, it's always easy for us to say. She had likewise, her heart was for many children, and we listened to some advice. You don't want to get pregnant your first year. You guys need each other. You need to grow. And I understand that. As a pastor's wife, and maybe her marriage wasn't what it ought to have been. And maybe they had such a rocky time. Well, we used some methods. Birth control pill. And we had some repercussions from that. and still think we do. But you know what? It scared me to death years later. And Stephanie finally started conceiving, and many miscarriages, but those were many babies also. We're very confident about that. That we have children waiting on the other side for us, and God's mercy and his care. Such a loving God that he is. But folks, one day I went down to the library. I started looking at some of the fine print. There can be a conception, but it can be technically aborted before the conception. When sperm and egg unite, the old birth control pill could cause that conception not to attach to the mother's womb. It scared me to death. I'll leave that right there. You think about that. There's all kinds of methods. But folks, that's, again, those are fruit. Could be fruit things. But what's the root? Psalm 127, 4 and 5. And Brother Jim showed 127 of Psalms, verses 3. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of a youth. Happy is the man, blessed is the man that has his quiver full of them. Full, not just half full. Not just a nice, convenient, couple kids. The neighbors next door, they've got an extra car. They get to do a little more fishing than I do. They got a little more money in the bank than I do. I'm ageist. Honey, 2 kids is enough. But happy is the man, fully satisfied. He's full to the brim, that has his quiver full of them. Lord, did I send you some arrows that I needed to keep? For they shall not be ashamed. Those kids will not be ashamed. And folks, look at the hypocrisy of it. How many times have we shamed people for having large families? I'm not saying that you're supposed to have a large family. Let God do that. Maybe you're not supposed to have any. God will do that. How many people have we shamed, and how many times have we been culturally obedient to what's going on around us? And we have those very seeds, folks, of abortion in our own hands. Is it no wonder that the world, when they don't see any difference in us, the value that we have on our children, check out these children in Psalm 127. It says, they shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. Folks, that means when someone comes to judge them for their lives, their godly lives will stop their mouths. We've been duped into thinking that it's a fearful thing to have a child, and we know, and that is a great fear to have. It ought to be the fear of the Lord instead of the fear of man. The devil ought to be scared to death that you're going to have kids. We've given up arrows. We've given up some of our weapons. How many of those children that have been aborted, I wonder which one of those could have been the one that met the enemy at the gate one day in Canada when a terrorist decided to come into America. I wonder if one of those other kids that were aborted could have been the one that caught the enemy at the gate at the airport, or before they walked into the plane with their weapons. Folks, there's hypocrisy on our side of it. We look at the world. How dare they think to love a tree more than they love a baby? When, folks, we have been culturally obedient. I'm thinking differently about talking to lost people who are approaching abortion and talking to them about it. That when I try to pick a splinter out of their eye, there's a sequoia redwood hanging out of my face. And I believe that may be the picture that God wants for us, folks, that as we try to help people and help lost people, and don't do that. This is evil. Abortion is evil. But God says, look at the heart. Look at your own heart, Garnet. David, look at your heart. You remember David as he committed adultery? And all the reasons that took him down to that point. The adultery wasn't the fruit. The adultery wasn't the root sin, folks. It was the mother of all sins. It was the pride. He's tired. I owe this. I deserve more. I need this. And he commits adultery. And then the sins that involved, and the other murders that involved, and the other soldiers, and Uriah's life was taken. And here's David, months and months into his sin. But God decided one day, I'm going to put a face on it. David, you know the Bible, you know the Scriptures, you know everything I've done with you all your life, and here you are, hard-hearted. You may have thrown a little forgiveness prayer up once in a while, but David, you don't have an understanding of what you've done and the hypocrisy that you are. So God put a face on it. You remember he sent the prophet Nathan, the rich man stealing the poor man's lamb and slaying it. And David, with vengeance to get rid of this kind of thinking, this kind of devaluation, this kind of injustice, and he was angry. Do you know any Christians that are angry, ready to blow up and bomb? We can't be that way, folks. We've got to get rid of the hypocrisy. I think God's burden is that we no longer have any hypocrisy, that we have no longer the seeds, that we come along his burden. I'm anticipating more of God saying, I want you to see what I see. I'm no longer hiding this burden. But I do believe he's wanting me and you to come alongside and not have any more affairs with the world. When we have the affairs with the world, we become blind, don't we? Was David blind? He really was blind until God put a face on it. God's going to be putting more faces on it. But let's join him. Let's join God in his burden until Jesus comes. Like the woman down in Katrina, somebody was, during the flood, the lady was interviewed by a newsman, and he said, man, what should we do? The flood and people losing their lives, people losing their homes, and she's a beautiful black lady, turns around and she says, you know what we need to do? We need to repent.